Hello there, friends. Welcome to BJJ Meditations. This is BJJ Meditations episode number 84. I'm your host, Joe Hannan, Joe from Jersey. Special format episode this week. Recently had the pleasure of discussing the namesake of this podcast, a book by the name of Meditations by one Marcus Aurelius, an emperor of Rome. Seminal text for me as sort of the gateway to living an examined life. And I think a foundational text for anybody who is serious about the martial art of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu or serious about living, let's say, a more balanced and stable life that's grounded in sort of like an emotional and an intellectual centeredness. This is an extremely utilitarian read, and it was a pleasure to sit down with some people who I really enjoy to talk about it, both over Zoom and in person. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
Thank you all for coming for our first attempt at a book club. As I was saying to everyone before I pressed record, as long as I have one other person interested in talking about any of these books, like I'm gonna do this. So I know your time is precious, and it speaks volumes to me that you would take the time to come out on a Sunday night when there's football on TV to discuss a book from the first century BC. Or no, AD. So thank you. I was saying to Jeff too, like I think structure-wise, I just want to set the table a little bit for you about Meditations and about Marcus Aurelius, and then I'm really just going to kind of open this up to the floor for broad discussion about what you think about the book. But Stoicism in general, as a philosophy, it predates the Roman Empire. Like this is something that was going on in the Hellenistic period, 3rd century Hellenistic period. And it took root right around the death of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. So you have these two pillars of Hellenistic Greece, both like a militaristic pillar in the form of Alexander the Great and Aristotle going to the other side of the river Styx within a year of each other. So people had this very strong, like, oh shit reaction, like, what do we do? It was a time of tumult, and Stoicism kind of came out of that as a way of like coping with the radical uncertainty of the age. Most philosophies, like Stoicism was like a metaphysics. It was a way of like arranging the universe, right? So they divided it into physics, logic, and ethics. But what endures today is mostly like the ethics. That's what people, and the logical side of it too, I suppose. Like that's what people think of it. Like the metaphysical side of it kind of doesn't really hold up. But essentially, like Aristotle, the Stoics were like very influenced by Aristotle. They believed that reality was essentially material, like the material world is real. But what sort of differentiated them from Aristotle was that everything, in their eyes, everything you see around you is animated by this living force, both human beings and objects. It's animated by this like ever-living fire, is what they would describe it as. They had different names for it. They would call it God or like a godhead energy, Zeus, or a logos. I kind of prefer to think of it like as logos, like word. That's like the living word. Christianity has kind of taken that on and sort of use it in a similar context, but logos is like kind of hard to define. It's a very like it's particular to the classical era, but I think it kind of nails what this is. So I tend to gravitate toward that. And then order and destiny, I've also heard some people refer to it as fate. But I think in the sense of Stoicism, fate doesn't really work, and I'll explain why. So anyway, like there's this ever-living fire. And much like Hinduism, which I think is pretty cool, there's this cycle of birth and destruction. Like this animating force goes through this natural cycle of birth and destruction of the cosmos. Like it goes through it over and over again. It has the same like cosmic drama element of Hinduism, but like from a slightly different point of view. And the cool thing about it is like, because everything is animated by this divine force, you can learn how to be like a better person by just like being in accordance with nature. Like this natural ordering force is the natural order. So like all you have to do is look around you and interact with other people and observe how nature operates in order to like to better yourself in the eyes of the Stoics. And how do we do this? And this is where we get into the stuff that endures today, like when people think about Stoicism. We do this by focusing on the things that we can control, thinking about clarifying our reasoning abilities, thinking about making our perceptions more precise, thinking about controlling how we react to external stimuli, and then kind of jettisoning the things that we can't control. It's very much like the serenity prayer in Christianity. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't control, et cetera, et cetera. So, if the animating force has this natural sort of chaotic energy to it, the way to cope with it is like the antidote to that turmoil is inner peace. So, like, how do we cultivate inner peace? We do it by focusing on what we control and not worrying so much about what we can't control. And in the Stoic sense, this would be the word apatheia in classical Greek. It sounds like apathy in the way that we mean it, but it's not. It's not apathy. Like if you read any of the other Stoics, like Seneca or Epictetus, Epictetus is a fascinating guy because he was a former slave. And they're a bit more colorful and lively than Marcus Aurelius. And they'll be the first to say, like, life is not this dry affair. Like when we think about Stoicism, we think about somebody who's like very serious and stern. These guys they knew how to enjoy life, but they also embraced its ephemeral nature. They knew it was transient, and they could be just as happy being wealthy and having finer things, or they could be just as happy, like Epictetus, like being a slave. Like, it's a state of mind. It's what you make of the external circumstances. So yeah, life is not this dour thing. And this is where I want to talk about like where fate doesn't quite get it in terms of like what the logos is or what, this divine fire is. The Stoics kind of believed that when I say fate, it's kind of like passive, right? Like this has been cast and this thing is going to happen to me no matter what I do about it, right? The Stoics believed that divine force, that logos was like raw material for you. Like you could go out there and make of it what you will. You could be Epictetus using your really hard life as a slave to like make something of yourself. So fate really doesn't quite do it justice. Like there is this sense of agency. And this is something I'll talk about a little bit later on, where I think like it breaks down a little bit. One of my favorite thinkers is this guy, John Vervaeke. He's a neuroscientist, a Canadian neuroscientist. And I think he describes what Stoicism is perfectly. And he says that Stoicism is internalizing Socrates. It's internalizing the Socratic method. You're constantly having a conversation with yourself, saying like, the weather's shitty today. Oh, is it really? Or, my girlfriend left me. This is the worst thing ever. Like, is it really? Mm-hmm. It's that little voice in the back of your brain that's always just saying like, think again, like let's reevaluate this. And not necessarily like put it through rose-colored glasses, but you're constantly having this Socratic dialogue with yourself. And it's the antidote, I think, to rumination. Rumination is the side of this that is not constructive. It's the side that leads to anxiety and depression. But when you flip it a little bit and you put like a Socratic spin on it, it gives you a sense of agency and it gives you the ability to cope with whatever's being thrown at you. So the last thing I'll say about Stoicism writ large is that this took root in Rome in a time, I mean, like Stoicism had predates Rome. It became popular in Rome at a time much like ours. It was a time of, maybe not right now, let's say like 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. It was a time of wealth, stability, opulence, and people were kind of just like, I think of it as like the 90s, the early 90s. People were comfortable, and then the yuppies were like, there's something more to this. I'm going to turn to some Eastern religion. I'm going to do LSD. I'm going to do this and that. Like just these inklings of there being more than the status quo. And at the time in Rome, that was going on too. And the quote unquote cults of the time were like Eastern religions, like Zoroastrianism, and this annoying thing called Christianity that just cropped up and like wouldn't go away. But it was a time where the order had been established, but people were like, not so sure about this order. What's going on here? And the Stoics kind of like were able to take a step back from that, a detached step back, and evaluate things dispassionately using that inner Socratic dialogue. I want to talk a little bit about Marcus Aurelius, and then I'm just going to open it up to your guys' reflections. So Marcus Aurelius, he was like a privileged guy. There's no way to sugarcoat this. But at the same time, he had like a pretty circuitous route to the throne. He wasn't somebody who was just like coronated at birth to be an emperor. He was born in 121 AD, and he was like one of the last philosopher kings. He came from this upbringing where uh, the Hellenistic influence was really strong still in Rome. So you were getting the classical Greek philosophy as like bedrock of your education. Um, and he was a warrior, like he was a general. So he had both that practical application of the martial art and the philosophical application of the martial arts that I find so attractive. Um, but he had a hard life. He lost both of his parents when he was very young. He was raised by his grandfather, and he was not the direct heir to the throne. It was like one of these strange stories of succession where like a number of people had to die, and then like all of a sudden he was like next up for the job. But there was this strange situation where like he had this brother who, by most accounts, seems kind of like a nitwit, and they were like supposed to co-lead, and Marcus Aurelius was like such a man of principle, even though like the person who predated him as the emperor said to him like, "You're the guy." He was like, "No, no, no! Like it's got to be my idiot brother and me." Like that was the deal. He just like stood on principle. Eventually, his idiot brother died though, and it ended up being him, and he's the guy that everyone remembers. But the thing to know about Marcus Aurelius was that he was he was in the shit for his entire reign. Like it was kind of this period of transition in Rome where the empire had gotten too big and they were engaged in all these border struggles. So like he takes over, plague breaks out in the Western Empire. Floods totally wipe out the grain stores. So there's this situation where like there's not enough food to get through the winter. Um, for most of his reign, he was like away from Rome. He was on the frontier fighting in these conflicts. Uh, and I think at one point, yeah, I have a note here. There was at one point one of his generals in Asia actually declared himself emperor, so he had to go there and put down that rebellion. And then like I think this general, his own people turned on him. And Marcus Aurelius, because he was just this man of principle, he pardoned this general's family. Like ordinarily, it would be like we're going to kill you and we're going to kill your entire family for treason. Marcus Aurelius didn't do that. Because unfortunately, he lost his wife on this campaign in Asia too, and that was like very, very hard for him. And then finally, there were these Germanic incursions on the eastern borders in the Danube in 176, and that's when he sat down and wrote Meditations. So, like, imagine being this guy in your late 50s. You're the emperor of Rome, the most powerful nation on the planet. You have barely even been in Rome. You watched your wife die while you were on a battlefield, um, and you're just sitting there in private. I'm assuming at night, writing these things. Like he didn't write these things to be read. He wrote them for himself. These were personal reflections, and history just happened to discover them. But they were never intended to be like surfaced in the way that they were. And this is a look into his psyche as it was evolving in real time. And it was a look into his coping mechanisms for how he was dealing with, like, he had arguably the hardest job in the world. And this is a look into this man's mind. And you see, like, the same fragility that we all experience on a day to day basis, the same weight, probably more weight on his shoulders, dealing with intense fear, uh, mortal danger. And this is how we get to see, like, this is how he reasoned his way through it. And I'm getting goosebumps talking about this right now because to me, like, that's what it's all about is you see this common humanity and you also see, like, what we're capable of when we harness our ability to think, to reason clearly, and to change our perspective. And uh, that was his life. And he died just as he lived. He died during that Germanic campaign in camp. It was March 17th, 189, at the age of 59. And this is what we have uh, from Marcus Aurelius. The way I look at it from a personal standpoint is this was sort of the bedrock of me living an examined life. If you look here, there's a date when I read this book, January 8th, 2016. That was a major turning point in my life. That was when I became sort of like the solopreneur. That was really when I embraced jujitsu and training as a way of life. And this was the book that helped me navigate that personal toll. And it became sort of, I don't want to say like biblical, but maybe a bit biblical in terms of how I assembled my worldview and how I assembled my abilities to deal with difficulties, especially in that training. As a white belt, just getting my ass kicked constantly. And this was how I got through every single training session. So that's why I wanted to select it for our first book to potentially discuss, because in terms of philosophical texts, you'll probably never find something that has more practical application than this book. So with that, I've said everything I have to say about meditations. I really want to know how you guys felt about it, what passages you found meaningful, where it didn't connect, or where it went wrong in your eyes. But I'm here mostly to listen. I just kind of wanted to set the table for our discussion tonight. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Without further ado, tell me what you think about meditations. And it's okay if you hated it too. As a Stoic, I will take no offense to that.
Okay, confession, Joe.
Yeah.
I thought we were going to read the book together, like maybe round robin, and like talk over time about certain passages. So I haven't read the book.
That's okay.
I thought we were going to be like page 1 through 5 tonight.
We're not going to do
round robin. Oh, okay. So that's my confession. I have the book. I have it on Audible.
Well, you should listen to it.
Yeah. Well, there's sometimes listening, I need to do both sometimes, but
Gotcha.
my brother bought me the book years ago, and it's one of my many books that are sitting on a bookshelf behind me. So I'm like, okay, this is a good opportunity to dive deep with some experts on the topic like yourself. And
Well, I wouldn't call myself an expert, but it's about.
well, your opening was great.
Yeah, it means a lot to me.
Yeah. So I think I'm prepared in the aspect of reading it all the way through. So
Yeah, well, report back to me when you do.
okay.
And perhaps someone else who read the book, if you care to just share your general impressions, I would love that.
Well, I can give you my favorite passages from it real quick.
Sure.
I really liked the one where he said, "What are you doing right now? Is this something that you're gonna miss when you're dead?" So I really like to make the most of the time. It was really interesting because this guy's the most powerful guy in the world, and so when I first started writing that, I was like, kind of what does he know? But he was kind of dealing with the same exact problems that we're dealing with, like people talking crap about him in the background, not worrying about that. So and then on a practical level, it's like, I know it's kind of silly because it's kind of like Proverbs, but the thing about waking up in the morning, I thought that was like such interesting thing because clearly he had some problems waking up in the morning. Like this is something he's writing down that he actually wants to like focus on. And yet it's more than that, right? Like it's about going out and communing with people. Like the goal is, it's not like necessarily waking up in the morning, but it's like, what is your goal? What is your purpose as a human being? And that was to go interact with other human beings. And so I know it may be silly, but there are times where I like don't want to get up for the 6 a.m. class to see Brandon, and I'm like, I think of that too. And it's like, well, what's your purpose? Well, let's go hang out with some other people. So yeah, really practical on a minute level, but then also like philosophical. Like, what are you actually doing with your life right now? And is this something that are you going to miss later? And that's relevant to jiu-jitsu too, because it's like, one day I'm not going to be able to do this. So I got to like appreciate what I'm doing right now. And then, also my wife helped me with this a little bit, but like the experience, like how you relate to jiu-jitsu, it's like he was writing this stuff down because he wanted to record his experiences and then record like how he interacted with them. And that is a little like jiu-jitsu. All you can do is like have your experiences, how feel, how someone moves against you, and then, use those to like grow and learn. So those are just like minor takeaways I had from the book.
Yeah, it's great stuff, John. It's funny, like, I feel like I had the same exact thoughts too, because at this time, I was working 4 to midnight. I was a news editor at the Star Ledger, and sometimes 6 a.m. was the only time I could train if I wanted to train at all, because I could never make any of the night classes. And that turnaround from getting home at 1 a.m. to getting up at 5 to make it was 6:30 at the time, so we'll call it 5:30. It was tough, but that particular passage was fuel for that endeavor on many of those shitty mornings.
There's I can't remember the exact quote, but there was something about, he was talking about gold and an emerald, and that like anything that comes on it, it's still an emerald. It's still gold.
Mhm.
And I was talking to Dixie. Dixie is my wife. I was talking to Dixie about it. She was like, "That's interesting. What do you think? Do you think that's like you can't learn and grow? You are what you are, or is it something else?" And I really think it's something else. I think it's that you can learn and grow and change, but you also have a core. That there is like you can't help certain aspects of yourself because it's a part of what you are, not like this body being a tool. The workings inside of it are what they are.
Yeah, I think that's I think this, if there were like we just transported Zeno from the Stoa in ancient Athens, which is like the porch on Stoa means porch, where they would all like gather and discuss these things. I think he would say like, yeah, man, that emerald, that gold, like that's the logos. You know, that's the divinity in you, the animating force in you. Like nothing external is ever going to damage that, but you can use that force to like transmute or alchemize all that stuff to become like more gold, more emerald, you know? It's not like a one and done proposition, but like nothing is going to tarnish that, you know, like nothing's going to happen to you to diminish that.
I'm curious, did anybody have a reaction reading this that like it forced you to look inside of yourself while reading it?
Yeah. No, fairly.
Yeah, I definitely did.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I was going to say a few thoughts. So I've been sort of thinking about this as well. And I discovered this over the last year, essentially in the last couple of years. Have been interesting, to say the least, in terms of professional and personal life for me personally. So just kind of going through a lot of experimentation, reading and exploring different things. Stoicism is one, Buddhism is another, Vedanta is another, which is an offshoot of Hinduism. So it's just kind of fascinating. And I kind of actually stumbled into it. So I was listening to a podcast by Dan Harris, 10% Happier. And then he was speaking to Ryan Holiday, then got into Daily Stoic, and then Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating, like, you know, the depth of the content, and how also, to your earlier point, it was actually meant for himself, right? So to your point also, it is an introspective journal to begin with, where the whole idea was that how do I it's an affirmation to myself, and how do I kind of improve as a human being? Because we, by default, are all a work in progress, and how do we actually sort of continue to get better, right? So those are some things I think about. But then it's interesting how his focus is also on like your thoughts and your actions both at the same time. And I just picked up a couple passages which I really liked, saying our life is what our thoughts make it, right? So that's essentially, if you're thinking negative, that is going to have that effect. If you think positively, that's going to have that positive effect. But then he also sort of says the focus on action is like, waste no more time arguing what a good person, what a good man should be one, right? So that's like you and what you talked about in the beginning. That's your own agency, right? The power of your own agency, and how can you make a difference? Because we often think about like, so and so has done X, Y, and Z to me, but at the same time, how are you reacting to it, which is the other component to it. And the last thing I would say is the urgency of things also, where like, you know, do every act of your life as if it were your last.
Yeah.
Right. So that's really important, where we just tend to think that, oh, there's time, we'll get to it whenever, but the time is now to act and actually do something. So those are some things that I could reflect on.
Yeah, I was thinking about that passage to, you know, like live this moment as if it's your last kind of thing. And like I had a wild situation with my son over the weekend. Like he has a peanut allergy, and I took him to this bakery we go to like every weekend after swimming lessons. Got him a brownie, and he came home, had the brownie, and just went straight into anaphylaxis. Like, and I had to give him his EpiPen to bring him out of it. And you know, it was just like a long, hard day. Like, fortunately, he's great now. The EpiPen did exactly like what it was supposed to do. But it just got me thinking about like that day that I had with him. And how much I didn't realize it, but like how much the quality of my presence to his swimming lesson mattered. Because like that could have been it. That could have been like our last swimming lesson together. And then like later on, you know, we all had a hard day. We were at the hospital for 4 hours because you have to be observed for 4 hours, like after you get epinephrine. And we were all just kind of like snippy. My wife, my son. My son was losing his mind. My wife and I were kind of just like at our wits' end, and we were all just like snippy. And I had this moment of like, "Hey, man, think about like what a to be crass, like what a fucking gift it is that you can sit here and like be snippy with each other. You know, like in I don't know, 100 years ago, like your son was dead. You know, it's a totally different evening. And this is the kind of practice, and because it does take practice, it takes practice to create that cognitive space to step away from the stimulus. But it's the kind of practice that really has proven results. And I'm telling you guys, like, it saved my life during this period in my life professionally. It was a dark, dark chapter. And yeah, like we have the power with enough practice to get skilled at that, just like everything we do in that room. And how daunting it seems when we first do it, like it becomes less and less daunting the more repetition we bring to it. Brandon, you got any high level observations for us?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I feel like you guys are all staring at me anyway, since I'm sure I'm like the TV you're looking.
When all four of us
all yeah, so I was struck by just from the very opening of the book, like I knew this guy was living at a whole other level than the way I've been living, the way I've lived my life, because he opens up with this huge, basically gratitude for everybody in his life, everybody who he has associated with, those who taught him. I guarantee you, I couldn't go through my life right now and pull out all the lessons that he's pulled out with my family, my teachers, my coworkers. Like, I would not be as grateful as he is. I think it's a very interesting sign of how he's the most powerful man in the world at that point. And instead of being what we conceive of as the most powerful man in the world, he's going through and he's saying how thankful he is for everything he's gained from all these people in his life. And that was a really cool thing. That's like an exercise I'd like to sit down and do at some point from every person that I interact with, not just hey, I really like this guy. He's great. Joe's awesome. I have a fun time with Jeff, but like, yeah, that guy at work who's a bit of a crab that I don't really like. I want to see what I can pull out of his life. What has he taught me? What am I grateful for from learning from that interaction? So that kind of grabbed me right from the start. But throughout the book, and I gotta say, I did notice this one was it was tough. I tried to listen to Audible, didn't get much out of it. I really had to read it physically to get much out of it. And the fact that it's not narrative is just, you kind of get overarching themes because it's not set up, it's not arranged in specific thematic portions. That I could pick out. It kind of blends and weaves. But I gained a great deal of live for the present. And it's not live for the present as in eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, hedonism type live for the present. It's more a matter of, he has a couple of spots in there where he phrases it differently, but he's talking about, why are you trying to make this name for yourself that's going to be passed on and lauded by people down the ages? Why would you be upset if you don't have that? Are you going to be any more upset that people didn't worship you, that your predecessors, they didn't even know about you? Same thing. You go far enough in the future, people aren't going to even know about you. That doesn't matter. It's not a matter of creating this big, shiny, famous life. It's a matter of living the best life in concert with nature, the logos, the being of the universe, finding how you are most in tune to it, how you are most made to be expressed, and living that life. That was something really cool. That's I've definitely had thoughts about that as I get older. Like, am I leaving any kind of legacy? Am I doing anything to improve the world? And I think it's really finding that balance of trying to do the best for society, for nature, for the world, for the universe, without getting too involved in like, am I am I the spotlight? Is it my works that are doing it, or is it just doing the right thing? He's talking at one point about a gentleman named Maximus, and he's got a kind of a long thing, but I pulled out one piece that I really liked just because he had a simple description of him as he presented the appearance of a man who could not be diverted from right, rather than of a man who had been improved. Like, I think that's a really high bar. I'd like to strive to be like somebody, you just look at that guy, he's going to be doing the right thing. He's not somebody who's, been improved by circumstances or hard work. He's just a person who just does the right thing. So that was a big thing that hit me. After that, it was a lot of things where I was surprised how much life of that era seemed to reflect life of this era. Even insofar as, like, he's talking about how, and I think this is where you get into the difference between, as you say, Joe, philosophy and philosophizing. He talks about philosophy something you should do. It should be actions. It should be almost like morals. It should be like right action, rather than sitting around and just talking yourself in circles and almost being like the talking heads we have nowadays. We've got another point where he's talking about what was my note on here? Yeah, he's got one point here where he's talking about the idle business of show, plays on the stage, flocks of sheep, herds, exercises, spears, so on and so forth. He's going on about these things, and they're just like kind of low mental capacity, like these little things that don't really mean much. It gets down to like the play of mice in the fields or the puppets pulled by strings. It is thy duty then in the midst of such things to show good humor and not a proud air. To understand, however, that every man is worth just so much as the things are worth about which he busies himself. So I feel like we're really surrounded by a great deal of fluff in life today. Just, the runnings of frightened little mice, puppets pulled by strings. I feel like that's 90% of social media and what people kind of put their effort into and like get worked up about. And that's cool. Like, you shouldn't be, basically don't be a dick to people about it. Don't be put on high airs and say how that's all beneath you. But, you're worth as much as what you busy yourself with. And I think it comes down to, there's a great many options for where you can expend your energy. You can get really wrapped up in a lot of things, but what of those are of worth? What of those are improving yourself? But really, what is an improvement for the greater whole? What's the improvement of society from any of those things? And I've got other things highlighted, but those are my big takeaways from what I got out of it.
Yeah, Brandon, I wanted to circle back to the eat, drink, and be merry thing, just because I think it's like such a sort of misinterpreted thing about the Stoics, that like they didn't know how to live. They knew how to live, but they didn't live frivolously. And I think it was Seneca who would do this exercise. Seneca was wealthy. He had a nice estate, lived a good life, but he would do this exercise where like a couple times a year he would like put on shitty clothes and like live like a poor person for like a few weeks. Like he would eat like really rough fare and just like live hard, just to like remember how ephemeral it all is. And this is something it transcends Stoicism. This is very much like a part of the Roman ethos. Like when Roman generals were awarded the honor of a triumph, they would be at the head of this parade, and they'd have like all the spoils of their campaign in the parade. They'd have slaves that they took from the enemies, like in front of them. And it was the one and only time when the commanding general or the emperor could wear a purple robe, because purple was the color of divinity. But even then, that general always had a slave in the chariot behind him. And he would say this, and the slave would just be repeating over and over again, "Remember, you're a man. Remember, you're a man. Remember, you're a man." And like, I think the most poetic interpretation of that I've ever seen is the very last scene of the movie Patton. Have any of you seen Patton before? No. It's like 4 hours long. It's about the General Patton. And the way they wrote that in the script of the movie was, it wasn't it wasn't thou art man, it was all glory is fleeting. And that was the slave was reminding the general, all glory is fleeting. And I think that's like what the Stoics really are all about. Like all the trappings of modernity that you love right now. I mean, we all saw how like quickly that could all go up in smoke, like during the pandemic. And that was the other thing I wanted to circle back to, Brandon, was you made the distinction of like this is an applied philosophy. And that's why I wanted to talk about it in this context of martial artists. You're all martial artists. You all live in applied philosophy and applied art when you step onto those mats and you bring it with you in your day-to-day lives. During the pandemic, I was like the rest of you cut off from jiu-jitsu, and that was a really hard separation. But I was in groups like this where it was a lot of smart people sitting on a Zoom call trying to prove to each other how intelligent they were, but totally disembodied and acting crazy and saying outlandish shit because they were not physically present in their body.
Mm.
There's something really important to what you said, Brandon, about this is like, it's not something you sit around and talk about. It's something you do. And there's like a realness and a gravity to people when you meet them.
Mm.
And they live in applied philosophy. They're not philosophizing. And I think the pandemic made a lot of philosophizers. It did not make a lot of philosophers. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, Brandon, was that part that grabbed you, where he's like listing all the people who formed him. That's like very much in line with the Hellenistic tradition of writing. Like even if you read the Odyssey or the Iliad, there are often like whole chapters that people will just skip because it's just like, this is so and so, son of so and so, who was known as the wielder of the hammer in the great battle of Thrace, and like, and that's like the tipping of the cap. Like this ancestral lineage was like so important to these people, but Marcus does it in a way that's like super poignant, and that doesn't necessarily come across in a lot of the epic poetry like the Iliad or the Odyssey. But I just wanted to point that out. That's a very Hellenistic thing, but he does it better than anyone else, I think.
Very cool.
Question. Anything that you're speaking about, I think, I mean, it all connects together really, sort of like, things to think about.
Mm-hmm.
But how much of it is Marcus Aurelius himself, and how much of it is like us all trying to embody some of that Stoicism and trying to sort of emulate that and live our lives through that? Like, can you sort of truly distinct the individual and their own individual qualities and what they bring to the table versus trying to sort of be like something?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. First of all, it's kind of hard to answer the question precisely from like a purely logical perspective, just because like we have so little surviving text from the Stoics.
Sure.
So I don't know. So the answer to the question from like a purely pragmatic perspective is like, I don't know. Like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and Seneca, and I think we have some Zeno. That's like all we have to go on, right? And they're all like heavily influenced by one another. But I think it is, to your point, I really do think it's a personal thing. We all have Josh Waitskin, the guy I work with. The way he likes to relate this concept or this principle is that like we all have this personal locus point. Like if you were to picture like a vast pool of water, right, and you were to drop one drop of water into the pool, you would see a series of expanding concentric circles. So like everywhere you drop that water drop, it's going to be a different locus point, but that point is going to ripple out and touch everything in the vicinity, in the container. So I think it's important to approach this or any sort of philosophical text knowing who you are, because I mean I think that's really what this was all about from a Stoic point of view. But it transcends Stoicism, right? Like we all relate to the world inward to outward. So I really do think that's part of the practical application of this. Right. Practical application comes from this process of relating and understanding, but it starts in your heart and soul. and it goes outward.
I guess it's all also being mindful about what you're saying or doing and how's that coming across and being conscious of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, I think having a practice like jiu-jitsu makes you more skilled at that.
Right.
Because it doesn't get more personal than what we do, more up close and personal and uncomfortable, you know?
Right.
I mean, there's never been a more direct example of living in the moment than when you are training.
Yeah.
There was a lot in this book that, like, talking about the pressures on him while writing this, but it sounded like there was a lot of freedom in like the thought of like, I can't give focus to what you may think of me. I'm just gonna focus on the things that I want to do and go after them as best as I can, in acknowledgement of, like, I'm not here to purposely like destroy anybody.
Sure.
Unless the goal would be like, I have to destroy this to get what I'm going for. I'm just curious, like, by the time I got to the end of it, I felt like it highlighted a lot of different things within myself that I was like, oh, this is making me want to draw attention to this aspect of myself that I think I can change through practice. I'm curious what that is for everybody else. If you had that experience reading it.
Well, I'm perfect, Joe.
like specifically, it made me think of like the messages I'll leave you or reach out to Brandon. I'm like, I had sent Brandon a message a while ago saying like, do I talk too much about like medically what's going on with you? Are you okay with that? And Brandon was like, I am, and also you don't have to. Like, no, you know. But there were like moments like that reading this where it just seemed like the power of just full conviction in what it is you are looking to do.
I mean, every time I revisit this in whole or in part, you know, like the same things that I view as bugs, not features of my personal mind, are there. You know, like I feel like he's talking to me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I have a natural propensity for rumination and anxiety. You know, I like if I did like I forget which, is it Myers? No, it's not Myers-Briggs. It's the one that, like, trait neuroticism is one of the, I forget which personality assessment it is. But I always rate high in neurotic energy, neurotic tendencies, right? And it just kind of calls my attention to it. It's not like it is a bug in the system, but it's a part of me. And it just kind of gives me the space to work around it. I don't know if that answers your question, but it does call my attention to that every time I read it. Like that moment I described, you know, with my wife and my son. If I never read this book, I know exactly how that moment goes.
Yeah.
You know, like a scene from Seinfeld. And it's not good for anyone. It's not good for my son. It's not good for my wife. It's not good for me.
Yeah.
But it brings a little bit of awareness to that flaw, that bug.
It's the same with me with anger. It like this, specifically the past 2 weeks, it really highlighted when I was like, I'm just letting anger run wild, and that is not, like, I'm gonna let go of that and find another choice here.
Yeah.
You know. So yeah, that's the bug in the system.
Yeah. But I will say, like, one of the questions, and I want to ask this of the group too, but I will say, like, no philosophy is perfect, right? Like there's no like unified theory, right? Like Ken Wilber wrote this book. I want to say it was like in the early 2000s, late 90s, called like A Theory of Everything. It's a great book. It's a great, like, it's about his philosophy is called like spiral dynamics, and you know it's a great theory, right? But Stoicism is imperfect, and this is sort of where I think you need to like hybridize and bring in other things to like make it work for you, right? Like one of the ways it breaks down for me is this idea of shaping how you think. Like you can do that when I'm like at my best, when I'm having a great day, I got 8 hours of sleep, my son's behaving himself, like there's plenty of space in my mind and I can detach from like stimulus and quote unquote intrusive thoughts or whatever. But there are times when like thoughts just happen.
Mhm.
It's like the weather coming in, you know. I was one of my clients that I coach, he and I were talking about the outcome of a recent competition. He was saying like one of the things that he wanted to do better or differently next time was he had this feeling of wanting it to be over and he didn't want to have that feeling again. Um, and he had this feeling of at one point of like quitting. You know, he wanted to give up. And I said to him, you know, like, okay, you know, maybe you can control that, maybe you can't. But I think really this is where sort of like the more Eastern approach melds nicely is like you can just look at that thought of like I want this to be over is like yeah it's just a thought like it's raining, you know, the rain is falling. It's up to you then to decide what you want to do with it. But that's sort of where I feel like you begin to butt into the limitations of Stoicism. Like it, I think we are, whether we have free will or not is a discussion for another day. But I do think we have agency, but agency isn't the be all end all, right? Like there are things where like no amount of agency is just going to help. So I feel like that's where you can bring in the more Eastern approach. Like this is we could really go deep on this. This is a very Western philosophy because it puts the individual like at the center of everything. And you know, I tend to agree with that for the most part, but there are certain things that transcend individualism, and I think the spontaneity of thought is one of them. Like we all have this universal experience of like, I don't think of a pink elephant. Whatever you do, don't. You're gonna die if you think of a pink elephant. It's like it doesn't quite work 100% of the time. It works well enough. It's like any other mental model. It works well enough to be useful, but it does sort of have its limits. And I'm curious what you guys feel are its flaws, if you felt there were any when you were reading the text.
You know, Joe, I don't know about flaws, but some of the things that really I try to do daily, you know, it talked about in the first chapter and stuff, self-government and sorry, you're going to hear some yelling in the background, but this is my home. So just being cheerful, it's like being a cheerful giver, you know, and you talked about Christianity, a lot of this stuff, you know, is stuff you'll read in the Bible, you know, doing acts of kindness, loving truth, loving justice. And Frank and I both experienced really, it's funny, in 30 years, right? Like it's like within the same year, we both experienced this. And it was like me prior on a much lower level because it wasn't publicized or whatever. But what he went through was so publicized, and we live in the town. And so, you know, when you go through this, you go, it's like, why do I have to go through this? Right. Like it's why I love jujitsu. I want to choose my hard. I don't, you know, I don't, who enjoys going through these hard things, but it's part of life. Right. So coming back to, you know, to use Ivy as an example, because, you know, she recently was injured, right? And I was talking to somebody about this. And if you believe in mindfulness or manifesting or whatever, and I had a 25-year-old at the time, young, you know, kind of like yourself, Joe, like 180, 200, all muscle, like coach tell me like, well, you're getting hurt all the time because, you know, you're thinking about it. And I'm like, oh, dude, I'm not thinking about getting hurt. I'm thinking about surviving. Like maybe it's because I'm like at the time, not so much anymore, but maybe it's because I'm 145 and you're putting me with like all the 230-pound like wrestling dudes, right? Like, and I'm, you know, they don't tell you don't play bottom game if you're small, play top game. So it's like with this thing with Ivy, I was thinking about that, and you know, she was following her post and stuff. Like maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe there's some truth. Oh, if I'm thinking about a red car, I'm going to see a bunch of red cars, right? But after going through these things that Frank and I went through, and you look back on it, right, and you're like, well, what was the lesson here? Why did we both have to have this same kind of lesson in a short period of time? Maybe mine was to help him navigate his. But But part of that, like to use your son as an example, Joe, right? Like I don't know the whole situation. You have to come back to me in a minute, babe. Um, uh, it's so easy to say somebody dropped a peanut in my son's brownie. How dare you? You guys have bad policies here, or ways you're putting together the food. And in a moment like that, especially life and death, oh my gosh, it's so freaking scary. Like to be in the hospital with a kid, and having those thoughts of, wow, that could have been my last swim lesson. It really puts things into perspective. So, these petty things, oh, they're ruining my name, they're ruining my character. Like, Jeff, you were saying this, like, what do you care what people think about you? People are going to talk about you one way or another, right? So we're packed animals. It's kind of hard not to let that get to you, but you have to have a good balance. Like my father, you always used to say, look, they're going to talk about you. Give them something good to talk about. So, I don't know. I found a lot of contradicting feelings, looking through these things. Like if I love truth and I love justice and I'm seeing something that doesn't sit well with me, even if it's not necessarily my business, if I'm in a place where they're promoting, integrity and family values, and we have kids there, how can I turn my eye to things that should not be happening there, kind of thing. So I don't know. I don't know that there's really an answer. It was very thought-provoking, to say the least. But I do. I think Brandon, you were the one talking about gratitude, and I do just every morning. Like women, particularly, I think I read in like 2018 or something, some statistic that said women say 50 negative things to themselves before they even walk out their front door. And like, whoa, when I heard that, I was like, this is just like, would I talk to my children that way? Like, would I talk to, so how could I talk to myself that way? And then, so hearing that and reading that, it made me like, before I even roll out of bed, when I first get up, even if like, sometimes I have that thought, oh man, I shouldn't have stayed on my phone last night, or I should have practiced better sleep hygiene, or I wish I had an hour more to sleep. I instinctive or like immediately turn that around to like, thank you, God, or thank you, whatever, for another day, right? Like, thank you for another breath, like, stretch. Thank God that I can get up. Like when I was working full time, 5:30, oh, I got to go 12-hour shift. Like, thank you that I have a job. Thank you that I have, that my body is able to keep me through that job. So like when you're in the thought of gratitude, you really can't go into that negative. Your brain just doesn't allow that, to have those two contradicting things generally. So, in the morning when I drop off my boys, I ask them, give me one to three things you're grateful for today. And that's how we start our day, and then I send them off with a blessing. But yeah, I really appreciated the beginning how he I could never read the Old Testament for that same reason you were talking about, like in the Odyssey and the Iliad, like, oh my God, like I'm like, who he begot who, and oh my gosh, like, and I get why they do that, and it's important, but it's just hard to read. But yeah, I don't know. I just rambled a bunch of different thoughts out there, but this is what I kind of went back and forth with some of this stuff. Do we care what people think? Yeah, we all do. And to say we don't to some degree is a lie, because we're packed animals. We all want to belong. We all want to be appreciated and liked. But ultimately, should that interfere with our drive and to do what we want? Because people are going to talk anyway. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That takeaway is the takeaway that I feel is the most important, because I've been a part of so many organizations over the years, whether it's like clubs, places I've worked, where that gossip mill has just ruined things.
Mm-hmm.
And I often think about like, well, how much different would it be if people truly embodied that? If people like truly just were not about what other people thought about them, we're not feeding the rumor mill, but really truly lived that principle as a way of life. I mean, I think it's a difference maker in so many places of work. But I will say, like, the flip side of it is, and I think this is like where sometimes as a leader, I have come across as like being aloof or distant or reticent on things like this because like I'm the first to like just shut down when like that kind of stuff happens. So like it is a double-edged sword. It is a double-edged sword. But Veronica, I think like what you're highlighting is the essential nature of agency in all of this. Like we do get to decide how we frame these experiences. We do get to write the story that articulates the meaning of the experience. I think if you haven't read it, Veronica, you'd really enjoy Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I think there's a copy here in the lobby that I might have left. Yeah, it's right there. Man's Search for Meaning. It's a great read. It's about as real as it gets in terms of like using your mind to shape your inner reality in the face of adversity. Same thing with the Gulag Archipelago, which is also here. Both great for those reasons. Not straight Stoic texts, but like elements of the philosophy are throughout both of them. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. I'll check those books out. Thank you.
It's also like the agency concept. It also comes down to acceptance, where how can I use my agency to accept things that are not within my control?
Yeah.
So that's another way to think about it. So I have two kids. My older one is my daughter is 17. She's a typical child. She's applying to colleges now. My younger one is a 14-year-old son. He's autistic. And for the longest time, I struggled with the concept where like my whole approach to his upbringing was how can I help him to get integrated? But over time, we realized, and my wife is a lot more practical than I am, and pragmatic as well. And I think we jointly recognized and realized that it needs to be independence, not integration, that we need to focus on. So just that realization was important for us. One of the things that I've developed as, of course, a reading book is a credo for myself and the team that I work with is do the best job of things that are in your control.
Yeah.
Right. So if I can just summarize that just helps me differentiate what's in my control, what's not. But once I know it's in my control, then I just go at it and do my best job. So that's
yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful that you're sort of facilitating that on a team level. Because I think that's where I've screwed up in the past as a leader. It's like it's partly why we're doing this. Is that it only does so much good if you keep it to yourself. You know, and it is a coming together. It's a communal. I think Brandon, you were talking about this. Like it's not so much what you do in isolation. It's like what you do in the public eye, right? In the view of others. How can you be about the work of being a good person? Of living the philosophy, and it's cool that you're able to do that with your team at work. I'd love to know how that works out. You know, how it works out.
Yeah, I think that there's actually a passage I was reading earlier that, and I'm sure some of this is based on the translations. Like they actually say, this word with the, yeah, and then this other word with the same word with the letter R, basically being the difference between being a part of something and being a member of something. And I think that's kind of highlighting that it's somebody who's just a part, just kind of like they're not really in it, whereas a member is really integrated and really just seeks the betterment of the whole, I think, rather than being that little divided portion which might be within something, but it's not working to the betterment at all, which is where that rumor mill, that little feeding of the ego starts.
Yeah, and so the rumor mill, the feeding of the ego thing, Brandon, like this is another thing that kind of like where I feel like we start to run up against the limits of Stoicism. Like one of Ryan Holiday's books is called Ego is the Enemy. And, Jocko, one of the things, before I talk about Jocko, one of the things I'll say is that like Stoicism, it's interesting that like there's one woman on this call. I was hoping Evelyn would come, but she said she couldn't make it. But like Stoicism is kind of like the manosphere has like run away with it, And like there's a side of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu too where you'll like see like some super aggro BJJ culture page where they're like holding up a quote from Marcus Aurelius, like totally out of context. So like there is that tendency to frame this as simply that, which is really reductionistic and not entirely accurate. But you know, I will say like this ego is the enemy. Like Ryan Holiday is really attached to that. Jocko will always say like kill your ego, and they're sort of like two figures, like manosphere figures. Like,
he says that with his name high above, like big font above that and everything. Come
on. I mean, I think this is where like Stoicism kind of falls apart a little bit because, and this is where more like the Eastern side of philosophy and religion kind of you meld them together and you get something that's a bit more functional. Like we all have an ego. You can't kill it. And in fact, like I think trying to kill it is like trying to push a beach ball underwater. You're just going to make the water more turbulent every single time you do it. I mean, maybe you can kill your ego if you become a monk and meditate in a monastery in the Himalayas for like 14 hours a day. But like most of us are living in applied philosophy. We don't have time to do that. Like we've been called to other things. Maybe later we will be called to that. I don't know. But right now, that's just not what we're doing. So this is where sort of you could just hold your ego in awareness. Say like, oh, that's my ego. My ego wants to do this, but you know, as the Stoics would say, like I'm operating from the ruling place, and the ego is separate from that. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We'll talk about that later. But to just say like it's dead, not only is that inaccurate, it's dangerous. It's risky to deny your ego, to deny its existence. That doesn't mean it has its hands on the steering wheel. But yeah, I think that ego is only the enemy if you let it be the enemy. And you certainly can't kill it.
It takes practice. It just takes constant work and just making sure that you're not like taking things personally. It's easier to say, but it's harder to do.
Totally.
You just have to continue to.
Totally. But like that pain is just, it's like, it's a meditation practice. It's just like, oh, something that hurts, it's telling me to pay attention, you know?
There's a branch of Eastern philosophy where, you know, your ego is not considered separate from, you know, rest of the nature. So it's considered one. And so that realization itself, you know, is like killing the ego.
Yeah. Maybe it's the same thing, but it like reminds me a bit of like the way Alan Watts explained Hinduism was that like it's this revelation that like God is all of us and we're all just like God in disguise. And I feel like the ego consciousness you're describing is like kind of similar. Like it's just this is just this another uniting thing, you know, like it's just another aspect of God consciousness. And like, guess what? We're all in on the joke. Like we all have this thing. Like once you see the greater scope of the cosmic drama, you can kind of like be a little bit less attached to it. So that's kind of like where I want to go with this book club, is like to oscillate between these different things that we can use to enhance our operating systems. Because I don't think Stoicism is perfect. I don't think any philosophy or worldview is perfect, but I think the work of being a philosopher is to pick up these things, examine them, consider what works for you, use it, and discard the rest. And I think we have the perfect like practice, embodied practice to like put these things to the test. And we just have great people here where we can sit around and have conversations like this. But that's sort of like where I see us going, is like maybe our next book will be more Eastern, because I think it needs to be there. It's interesting. Like the older I get, that's the direction I'm drawn in. You know, so far removed from how I grew up.
A book similar to what you were mentioning, Answer to Meaning and others as well. One that really kind of fascinated me was The Road to Character. Think everybody ever been like? It's a fascinating book. It's about like all these different people in history over the last like 100 odd years, and talks about Marshall and how like we came up with the Marshall Plan, but he had the opportunity to be Eisenhower and then kind of command the military and the army, etc. But didn't want to do that because, to Brandon's point, he wanted to be a member, he wanted to be a part of the process and kind of build a coalition, etc. So, and he contributed in many different ways in terms of the Reconstruction post World War II. So that Road to Character is just a fascinating book about these various different people who've taken themselves to be part of the process, and also they've taken the power of their own agency to create meaningful impact in society. So I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah, I wrote that down. Sounds like a great read. Well, seems like we've hit a natural ending point. I just want to open it up. Does anyone have any final thoughts they would like to share before we conclude the evening's festivities?
Yeah, I'm interested in exploring some of the more Eastern stuff too. I know I've been really interested in what I've heard from Alan Watts and kind of getting more into it too, because it seems a little bit more something I'm inclined to, though I have the same problem with it that I do with most other philosophies I've run into. It seems very passive. I get that from most philosophies, Christianity, let go, let God, everything else is just kind of just abide, and some of that appeals to me because I do like to just tough it out and just go with things and then persevere through them. But kind of interested in seeing the differences between Stoicism and Eastern philosophy, and with, you said they contrast in how much agency or how much centricity that it is for the self. So I'm looking forward to where we go with this one.
Well, Brandon, wait till you figure out that there is no self. Then it's going to get...
Makes sense.
Yeah, I forget which book it is by Watts, and the name of it escapes me. It might be The Way of Zen. There's another one, though, where he focuses more on the cosmic drama that we've been talking about. That might be more appropriate. Just need to figure out which one it is. Yeah, I'm leaning in Alan Watts' direction. I feel like he's the yin to Marcus Aurelius's very strong yang energy.
That last big, the last big quote before the book ends of, if it's right, do it. If it's true, say it, right? He does talk a bit about when you're telling the truth, like how to kind of like how to deliver it to somebody, because it seems like depending on who's on the receiving end of that truth, it seems like approaching that like you're talking to a kid.
Yeah,
is a great way to let somebody know something. I don't know. That was my closing thought. Something that stuck with me.
Yeah, something I'm notoriously shitty at.
Well, this is great, guys. I really appreciate this, and I look forward to seeing what the next book is. So thank you for this.
Well, guys, big Alvin join us at some point.
Yeah.
Arizona Pat, if you're still there, thank you very much. Do you guys have anything you want to share before we conclude for the evening?
No, I was just thinking when Jeff just said that, I forget how it goes, and I'm awful about remembering order of things, but there was I think they made a meme out of it where it's like jungle characters when you're saying if it's right, do it. If it's true, say it. But it's can't get mad at a turtle for being a turtle. So not everybody's going to hear your truth as truth. So in those situations, sometimes I'm learning this. Sometimes it's better just to, not even waste your breath. And I hate to say that, but you have to read the room.
Yeah, you do. All right, guys. Thank you very much for attending tonight. I'll let you know what I'm thinking for the next book, and we shall meet again. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much for listening to this week's episode of BJJ Meditations. If you enjoyed this discussion, we have another one coming up. This time, we are going to be talking about Alan Watts' book, which is often referred to as The Book, or On the Taboo of Knowing Who You Are, which is an exploration of Vedanta that is well-suited for a Western audience. It was, again, another seminal text in living, I think, an informed and examined life. So hopefully I think it could be beneficial for you as a listener of this podcast. If that interests you, I believe the date is going to be October 20th, which is a Sunday, and it'll be from 7:30 to, I believe, 9 o'clock or 8:30 Eastern. The link to sign up is in the show notes. And regardless, thank you very much for listening, folks, and I will see you next week.